Hello and welcome back to Podcast from the Edge with me, Peter Bruce. As we head towards the Christmas break, it's a treat to have easily my favorite guest back on the podcast, Tony Leon, once leader of the DA and since then an ambassador, tireless author and speaker. He has a unique ability to cut through the chuff of our modern politics and always to find the crisp point at the end of often endless and excruciating issues. Thanks for joining me today, Tony. I know you've been traveling, but you came back just in time for some of our sort of big bang events to close out the year. And top of the list probably has to be the G20 Summit in Johannesburg 10 or so days ago, and a fallout that you could probably see coming. US President Donald Trump, not always the brightest bulb in the chandelier, even at the best of times, he's now going to try and block South Africa from participating in the next G20 next year when America has the chair. It's hard to know exactly why, but when he does try to explain what he's doing, he falls back on persecution of whites in South Africa, genocide against Afrikaner farmers, and even his closest advisors, and we all know, they must know too that this is not even remotely true. But they say nothing. How do you think he might follow through on his threat, and who might stop him?
Well, thank you, Peter, first of all, for a very warm introduction, very generous. Yes, I'm back. I was away, and this was quite a spectacle, not just G20, but as you say, Trump's reactions to it, both before it happened and during and after. Look, and at the risk of plagiarizing an excellent article in the Financial Times on the weekend by Gillian Tett, I don't think Trump has some grand strategy, and I think his own White House is very factionalized between various warring components inside it. So, and he's really operates enormously in a fact-free universe. So whether, in fact, as I believe he's entirely incorrect on the white genocide claim, once he gets an idée fixe in his mind, he sticks to it until he changes his mind or moves on to another topic. So I don't think it's a kind of objective thing. You can say, well, we don't have a white genocide, and, you know, it's wrong to say that. I mean, that might be and is indeed correct, but I don't think it's going to change things very much. I think there are some fundamental background issues which South Africa has chosen not to address, leaving aside all these highly contentious and wrong claims from Trump and Trump world, which have bedeviled our relationship with America and will continue to do so. And, you know, Peter, what struck me from what I read of Cyril Ramaphosa's address last night, self-congratulating his presidency on the successful G20 last weekend in Joburg, is that Ramaphosa took no responsibility for any of the problems in the relationship. It's all due to others. It was Afriforum, or unnamed, Solidariteit, whoever. There were the sort of fifth columnists within. There was the misinformation without in the White House. But actually, it's nothing in South Africa's policy toolkit that has caused us to get to this point. And I think objectively, there are some big headline controversies swirling around in the South African political space that make the resolution of our relationship on a successful footing more difficult. And unless and until those are acknowledged, I think it's going to be hard. And what also my understanding, my information is probably as good or as bad as anyone else's coming out of Washington, D.C., is that if South Africa doesn't move or allow some more flexibility on BEE, and if South Africa doesn't do something about expropriation without compensation, then I think we're going to be stuck with a 30% tariff. And incidentally, well, and kind of Ramaphosa alluded last night in this address, the tariff issue or the tariff war is far more important than whether South Africa is included in the G20. As I wrote in my News 24 column earlier last week, you know, the G20 is performative. It's diplomatic theatrics. It doesn't really move the dial. It's a nice to have. You can get something out of it. But if you think this is a great diplomatic moment in the sun, I think you're living in the wrong political universe.
So, you know, Tony, we all know what and who Trump is. And I don't know whether you read it, but the Wall Street Journal has published an astonishing account of how he's trying to enforce this Russian-inspired peace plan for Ukraine in return for absolutely eye-watering opportunities for his family and friends to invest in Russian companies and natural resources. What was it wise, do you think? And I'm speaking to you now as a former ambassador, for our foreign minister, Ronald Lamola, to openly call him in an interview on CNN just before the summit a white supremacist? I mean, he probably is, and I can say that, but short of war, would a responsible diplomat say that?
I think it's the most self-harming remark, and I'm not going into the merits or demerits of it. You know, if you go back, I mean, we theoretically have, I don't know if he's paid or unpaid, a special envoy to the United States, Mcebisi Jonas, but I mean, they scraped from the internet from a couple of years back, his remark, and they go back to Trump's first presidency, 2016. And we all say things in the fullness of time that we either come to regret or think are incautious in the light of subsequent events or elections. So, I think that's imperiled Mr. Jonas's diplomatic mission. But he didn't say it now. He didn't say it on his appointment. For Ronald Lamola to go and make a remark like that, you've got to say, where's the gain in it? Even if you're correct, apart from, having a degree of saying we won't be bullied. If I can just segue for a moment, Peter, to something, for reasons that are too obscure for me to bore you with. I happened to watch a video on YouTube the other day of a time when I was 20 years old, a long time ago, and that was the 1977 South African general election, when John Vorster bestrode a colossus called the National Party government in days of yore. And that was a time when South Africa was under enormous international pressure, not just from the United States, but the Western world, post Steve Biko, and the UN had just imposed an arms embargo on South Africa. And Vorster, truculent, defiant, said, let the world do its damndest, as he put it. And, we will never surrender. And, he did very well in the next election. I don't think this will help Ramaphosa now. So this idea that, you can go to a powerful country and give it the middle finger might give you a moment of satisfaction. But I think worthwhile diplomats and meaningful diplomacy, you have to think twice before you react. And clearly Mr. Lamola was caught up in the excitement of his post-G20 vibes. And that was a mistake, but it's not the only one. I mean, you alluded in your Sunday Times column correctly to our unmanned embassy in the United States. I mean, the fact is, since Rasool's expulsion, when was it? 9 months ago, we haven't appointed an ambassador. So it's just to me, South Africa's diplomacy is amateur hour, kind of, it's almost verges on malpractice, in my view. If you want a result, if you want to join the cheering gallery of the anti-trumpets in the world, well, that's a very overcrowded saloon, and no doubt it makes you feel good, but I don't think it's going to meet any of this government's apparent objectives to grow the economy, get investment here, and bulk up our trade profile.
We'll come to the issue of the embassy and embassies in a minute, because there are a lot of embassies that don't have ambassadors in place, I'm told. But how does this South African government deal with the groups here at home who push the narrative that Trump then embellishes, right? I mean, we're a free country. Are there Afrikaner groups Cyril should be listening to? Not just the obvious ones who penned a helpful statement a few weeks ago. Why not talk to, I don't know, the Freedom Front Plus? I mean, they're in his government of national unity, after all, or even Solidarity, who were once speaking before, only 2-3 years ago, who were in advanced sort of state of cooperation with the Mbeki Foundation. But Cyril seems to insist on doing everything himself. Is there any room, do you think, here, politically, for him to talk to Afrikaners, not the ones who are, backing him up, but the ones who are causing the problem?
Absolutely. And, this is once again a contradiction. And he mentioned in his address to the country last evening, and he said it in his G20 remarks, we're a country that's founded on national dialogue, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is all just words. It's a word salad. It's got very little nutritional value, mainly because he doesn't practice what he preaches. So if you've got a problem, and apparently the government does, with people like AfriForum and Solidarity, why don't you listen to them or speak to them? You don't have to agree with them. You claim that you're a government of dialogue. But, Peter, you can bring it closer to home. There's barely any national dialogue in the GNU, as we know. I mean, it took about 100 days, I think it was, for Cyril to sit down with John and the other partners in the GNU and have some kind of get-together. And they generally operate entirely in silos, as we know, and everyone does his own thing. So it's not even a joined-up government. And at the same time, we've got this national dialogue. I don't know where it is, costs a lot of money, trundling along with very little sight or sound of what it's achieving. But, I mean, a dialogue is a conversation between, more than one party, and it's generally is used by people who have differing viewpoints. So I saw the president's spokesman dismiss the idea of speaking to Solidarity and AfriForum. Well, there's a huge contradiction there, because if, as Cyril alluded to in his remarks last night, certain people unnamed are responsible for feeding the disinformation to Trump, and they literally living across the road from you in Pretoria, why don't you pick up the phone and say, okay, fellows, I think what you're doing is wrong. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Let's speak about it. And even without a dialogue, let's just take an obvious point that arose in no lesser forum than the White House Oval Office in that ill-fated visit earlier this year. What's to prevent Ramaphosa mero motu, as you say, of his own bat, as it were, denouncing kill the Boer as a slogan? I mean, that is, in my view, hate speech. There's some bizarre court ruling that it isn't hate speech, but I think in the ordinary and understandable meaning of plain English it is. But whatever it is or it isn't, why doesn't he stand up and say, I do not approve of such incendiary language used against a community in South Africa? And this is proof of the fact that I don't believe there's any concept of genocide against targeted groups in this country. Well, the moment that you leave unaddressed, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, you giving ammunition, forgive the clumsy metaphor, or sustaining a clumsy metaphor, to people who say, well, what about that? And they don't address it because no doubt it displeases some minor constituency in ANC world to address it.
Presumably he must see some benefit for himself politically, locally, in standing up, quote unquote, to Donald Trump. I mean, if you read social media, and I understand social media is not, not the country, it's not reality, but there's lots of support coming there for him from, I presume, sort of, middle-class, traditional ANC voters who might have been on the point of sort of drifting off. He's suddenly drawn them possibly back into the fold. I mean, one pollster, an experienced pollster, was telling me the other day that he thought Cyril would do, himself a lot of electoral good come the local government elections next year, by taking the stand that he has.
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about that, and I haven't seen polling evidence, but I did see three real live polls last Wednesday, 3 days after the G20 closed, where the ANC lost left, right, and centre. It lost a seat to the MK, lost a seat to the DA, and lost a seat to the PA. So that's pretty much across the board, not doing very well. Now, of course, they're local government elections. They weren't necessarily, in the absolute urban heartlands, whatever. But I got chastised by a one-seat, wonder-party good when I ended off my last piece saying all politics is local. Ha, ha, ha. Well, I didn't say that. Of course, it was said by the famous Democrat speaker, Tip O'Neill, who was a ward healer of great ability. And I was very struck in one of his more recent successors, the great, and she really was a very effective woman, Nancy Pelosi, said of the extraordinary Democratic Party successes in New Jersey, in Virginia, and in the city of New York, that basically most elections are decided at the kitchen table. Now,
Yeah.
Given my time, I'm sure there's a lot of other consciousness in South Africa. We've got a race issue, we've got a historical issue, but I think more and more people are correctly, to the extent they bother to vote at all, and that's another matter for contemplation, how few people actually register and how few vote, is that people are transactional with their votes. They don't use their votes to say, oh, you stood up to Trump. It might reassure some people, but I think at the end of the day, the only voting benefit from the G20, aside from any other wins or losses from the Joburg-Nasrec show, is in fact that it might have stirred the city of Johannesburg administration to rise from its torpor and, clean up the streets, at least between Nasrec and Sandton. I don't know. Apparently, if you go off any off-ramp, it's the same old disaster and dysfunction.
Yes.
But as a Potemkin village exercise, if they could extend it, they might win some benefit. And that was spurred by the embarrassment of a world-class African city, self-proclaimed being anything but that, until it was parts of it were cleaned up for the G20.
Yeah. And okay, leaving aside South Africa and dealing with it, what can the government do abroad? I thought Ramaphosa was quite measured and possibly even a bit more boring, really, when he spoke on TV on Sunday. There were no insults, at least. But it is, as you were saying earlier, stunning, surely, that we don't have an ambassador still in Washington. And I hear Ramaphosa may forego an appointment completely for the next while, because he wouldn't want to put his chosen favorite, Alistair Reuters, in a position where he would then have to ask Trump or Rubio for permission to appoint him. If you read there's a story in the Sunday Times about Cyril, intent now on going it alone without, stopping to try and do any kind of agreement with Trump. And I understand from other sources that is very accurate. But it does leave Reuters, for one, doing everything on his own. And we, as I was saying to you earlier, we don't have ambassadors in Japan or China either. And I keep being told, and I haven't checked it because I'm not really sure how, that dozens of our embassies don't have ambassadors in place. You've run your own embassy in Buenos Aires in Argentina for many years. I mean, could that possibly be true?
Oh, apparently it is true. What I will tell you, I don't want to overstate the role of an ambassador. The embassy that I led in Buenos Aires from late 2009 onwards for the next few years had been leaderless in the 6 months before I arrived. The previous ambassador had been sent to the Netherlands, and there was a gap. And we had very good staff. We had very good locally recruited personnel. We had some mixed bag, but mostly very good South African diplomats, but not that many, because there were only 7 transferred officials. And I will tell you, an embassy without an ambassador is like a company without a CEO, because the staff just is on, remote control. It's very difficult to get anything done, and it lacks authority. That's the real problem. And its transactions and interactions with the host country get downgraded by the host country in the absence of a fully accredited plenipotentiary or ambassador. So it is, I mentioned diplomatic malpractice at the beginning of this interview. That's another form of malpractice. I don't know whether it's idleness or incompetence or deliberate strategy. Choose your category, or some combination of all of the above. But it's not a good look. And, I'm deeply skeptical about the plethora of diplomatic missions that we have. We have far too many for a country of our size and with our fiscal problems, and a lot of them should be closed down, consolidated, and centralized. That's another argument or issue.
Yeah.
But the countries you've identified, Japan, China, United States, I mean, they are absolutely core to South Africa's economic needs and trade. And it's just incomprehensible to me that they are unled. So, yeah. I agree with you.
Tony, assuming that I'm incorrect and the Sunday Times is incorrect, if there was an ambassador, a good ambassador in Washington right now, what would they be doing?
Well, look, an ambassador speaking from personal experience, unless you've got a very long leash. I had a very long leash in Argentina because South Africa was largely, uncontroversial in its relationship with the South, or the three countries I represented us in South America. And since Pretoria was so slow to respond to any of my deliberate requests, I kind of, interpreted my mandate on my own, and with, let me boast for a moment, with great success in terms of the trade figures and the public. Well, you witnessed that yourself, so let me not paint my own lily or gild it. Others can. But the truth of the matter is that even the best ambassador operating, in ideal circumstances is still constrained by his political masters. And in our case, a lot of the, let's just deal not with the white genocide claim, because I think for reasons that it's not factually based and you're not going to interrupt that particular narrative, short of doing a number of things that could be done at low cost for South Africa, but we've discussed those. I think are going to require a change of policy or direction from South Africa. Obviously, Starlink, Elon Musk is a big number. That's got a lot of attention in Washington. Using equity equivalents in place of BEE, which is state policy in some areas of the economy, but not in others, would be an obvious way to go. And then I think they do need to address the property rights issue. It's all very well to say the courts have some kind of jurisdiction over expropriation cases, but frankly, when the government goes around trumpeting, as the deputy president recently, that expropriation without compensation is our policy, well, you're going to be setting a lot of hairs running at that moment, as they do. But I think because they kind of want a good relationship with America, but they want to have everything else as well. And they're not prepared to give anything up. It's like, to use the quote, the old cliche, they want their cake and they want to eat it. Well, you can't do that in real life.
Yeah. Just before we leave America, is it possible that Trump is setting us up for something even worse than what we've seen so far, like sanctions? We're not Venezuela, but could it get really nasty? I mean, for instance, a lot of black and white South Africans are going to want to go and watch Bafana play in the Soccer World Cup in the US next year. Will they even be allowed in?
Well, let's just frame this generally, and I think I can say this with little contradiction. Trump is a deeply vindictive person. He is mercurial, he's transactional, and he acts on impulse, on his gut. Doesn't read carefully, doesn't think of the long-term consequence. I think we've seen that. So you have, for example, threatening war, maybe actually bombing the narco ships from Venezuela on the one hand, and then pardoning the former president of Honduras, who's one of the biggest drug smugglers into America, on the other. So there's no joined-up, coherent strategy in the Trump administration. He reacts and acts often on impulse and on feelings. So if he feels aggrieved, and we don't have to interrogate why he's feeling aggrieved, with justify or not, I think he will look for more hits on South Africa. And, losing tourist visas is unfortunate for people who can afford to go. I mean, there are a range of other measures. I was reading, not all of it, but some of the detail in the Republican Senator Kennedy's bill that he has introduced into the United States Senate on the South African government and on steps to be considered against it. And, for example, if they use the Magnitsky Act, which is part of the embedded legislation in the Senate, to sanction individuals, and there's been talk of anyone named or implicated in the Zondo Commission, that's one thing. If they then introduce economic sanctions by simply, excluding South Africa from the SWIFT system, or we'll basically sterilize most of our international trade and transactions. So I'm not suggesting this or asking for this. Let me tell Mr. Ramaphosa and his colleagues who listen to this, I'm not one of the fifth columnists. But, I mean, be aware of the fact, however much you dislike America or the administration in office, America's armory is immense because, and the app, there's certainly no alternative for the next while, and certainly not now, to using the dollar, to using the United States financial institutions for trade and financial transactional purposes. And things could get very, very difficult quite soon. Or maybe not. Maybe, Trump will go on to some other matter. He'll lose interest. I mean, I think we do spend an enormous amount of time worrying more about performative things and worrying less about substantive things. I put the G20, incidentally, Peter, into the area of diplomatic performance. It's not substantive. Yeah. It doesn't do things that change anything. They make statements and they have declarations, but not much else. But, he's a nasty and vindictive person, Trump, and he might take action.
Yeah. And given that, we're a year now out, more or less, maybe a month earlier, a month later, a year out of the local government elections here. And I was wondering how you think your old party, the DA, is placed for the fight, and whether you think we really know what it's fighting for. I mean, does it want to displace the ANC eventually, or be part of forcing it off its throne? Or is it merely playing for a smaller role? Get a few metros, perhaps a few more ministers in a GNU after 2029. It seems to have settled for being a relatively smaller party, 20%, it's 21% perhaps now. There's no evidence really, and you certainly don't see it from the leadership now that they're in the GNU, of the DA going out and fighting for a bigger chunk of the political pie.
Well, let's put it this way. When I was in politics, I was very much a conviction politician. I had a creed. A lot of people disagreed with it, incidentally. I remember Ray Hartley, one of the editors of the Sunday Times, that as he became a very good journalist, describing once a man who talks like Margaret Thatcher. Well, it wasn't that I agreed with her, but, she had a standpoint. She had conviction. She wasn't a consensus seeker. So I incline towards saying, within pragmatic bounds, push your ideology as much as you can. I think I see very mixed evidence of that on the DA side, and it's something I'd like to address in a more public forum when I get around to thinking about it. But here's the interesting part of it, Peter. It seems to me that even though the DA has had a series of policy, even political reversals in the GNU. There's a long laundry list of red lines that the ANC has crossed with impunity. And you don't see much evidence of DA ideology in, for example, the Department of Basic Education. DA in opposition was extremely vocal and vociferous on the stranglehold that the SA Democratic Teachers Union had on teachers' appointments, on the refusal of having quality testing of teachers, on the low 30% pass rate. Now, I haven't seen the DA minister change that, and maybe she can't change it, and maybe so there's evidentiary. That's one set of evidentiary facts. The other, and here's the interesting thing, it seems as though people are not that interested in ideology. And, some of the polls I've seen, they're not quite as modest as you suggest, but who knows, they're opinion polls and they change, suggest that despite, what you might say are policy reversals or even an absence of DA identity in the ministries controlled by the DA, some of them are more obviously DA than others, that at least the voting public seems to rather like the fact that the DA is in government and seems to reward the DA for being in government, at least by expressions of support. So it's an interesting situation. Now, I think we'll have more hard evidence when people go and vote across the country in the local government elections. Of course, you can't extrapolate from a local election what will happen in a national election. But as to what the ultimate DA, the DA could do three things. Say, look, we're going for broke. We're going to try and get our maximize our vote. That's what any political party should do. And we're going to try and be the biggest component in a future government. Or they could say, we'll get our vote up and we'll get the ANC down somewhat, and then we'll have better terms to enter the next GNU on a much more advantageous basis than the current GNUs from a DA point of view. Or they can leave the GNU or be expelled from it and then go it alone, which obviously I think those are the three outcomes. And I don't know, and I'm speaking quite frankly here because I have not been consulted, nor should I be, as to what the long or medium-term strategy is, if the party has one. It might have, and it might be working its tactics around a long-term strategy, or it might be, busking its way from situation to situation.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, if there is a strategic debate going on inside the DA about what sort of party they want to be, they've managed miraculously for South Africa to keep it extremely quiet. To what extent do you think, Tony?
Well, I noticed that. I noticed that. I was. I mean, it's a very interesting question. You do raise it in your columns. Do political parties actually need an ideology? I mean, I think they do. That's my view, and I was fairly ideological without being extreme. Or do people vote on a vague idea of more or less what the party is? And is it enough to say, well, they better government party, they're less corrupt than the ANC, I'm going to give them a chance? The evidence is very mixed. I mean, let's take an extreme example of this.
No. So, you were saying earlier, and all politics is local, which might trump, not excuse the pun, which might trump ideology. Maybe it is as local.
Maybe, but you've got to say, I did I'm still happily, since the book's still selling. Let me give it a punt here. The book you kindly launched in May. I was doing a book event for being there. My book of this year. In the Southern Cape. And there are a lot of governance issues. Apparently, the DA lost its majority in George, and there were a lot of rumblings. And big audience. There isn't that much to do in Wilderness on a Wednesday night, so I had a big crowd. And there were a few grumbles and rumblings in audience, and I said to them, okay, would you? Let's assume all your complaints are correct. Do you think that the DA should leave the government of national unity because it can't achieve X, Y, Z? And practically no one thought that was a good idea. And, to go back to what I wrote in my book being there, because it was the very good observation of Sir Mick Davis, the former South African businessman who wrote to me during those negotiations. He said you were always playing one trump short because the alternative to the DA being there is the EFF and the MK being there. And so I think a lot of DA folk, however pleased or disappointed they are with the DA's performance in government, keep that thought in mind. And maybe they even, never mind the ideology, never mind the achievements or the lack of achievement, they'll continue to reward that with their votes.
It's still, no, I'll take that entirely, but it's still a fact, that across all statistics, all elections, the thing that keeps the DA in the game is the ANC's decline, right? So it delivers apparent success to the DA, but there are other much madder parties taking the vote away from the ANC and not the DA. How long does that continue?
MK is a very good example. I mean, they keep winning by-elections. All right, they tend to be in rural KZN, so it's not the country. And it seems to matter not a jot that the party does nothing in Parliament. They keep, they removed that John Schlopper as their leader. I don't know who the head of the MK in Parliament is. That person is the leader of the official opposition position I used to have. Used to be much fought over who's going to be the official opposition. Seems to matter not at all with a whole chunk of voters. So, Peter, the older I get, the more I know the questions without knowing the answers. So I don't know.
Yeah.
And does anyone? Yeah. What actually informs people's choices when they line up in a polling station and go and cast their ballots? It's not as clear to me as I once thought it was.
So what worries me about the GNU is how quiet and almost submissive, I suppose, the DA can sometimes seem. John Steenhuisen, the DA leader, was quick to trumpet what a wonderful success the G20 Summit was, and I'm sure from his perspective it was. But everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet, and often do. But there are still excessive things happening all the time that we hear nothing about from the DA. For instance, we're about to license businesses, right? And you can just see the opportunities for bad behavior exploding out of this. Who's going to sit in judgment of me wanting to start a construction company in, I don't know, Bredasdorp, or a
it is an
distribution?
outrageous bill.
Absolutely.
Outrageous
But
piece
how
of
quick,
legislation.
but hang on, Tony. So all this is coming from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, which Steenhuisen has left without a second DA deputy minister for practically the whole year.
But sorry, can I correct you? Well, I hope I'm not correct.
Oh.
My understanding, what kind of makes it worse, is that it's come from the Department of Small Business, that particular piece of legislation. If I'm correct.
It would have to drift through the DTRC.
Why would we have a Department of Small Business? There is a DA Deputy Minister of Small Business. It might be that the Deputy Minister had no say, but I imagine, I don't know this to be a fact, I'm asking the question.
No, you're probably setting me to wrath.
Before a piece of legislation gets released for comment, I mean, this is not a law yet, and hopefully the DA will oppose it when it goes Parliament, doesn't it go through the cabinet? Does the cabinet say anything? Did anyone say anything? Well, I mean, all you have to do, and I have very high regard for her, is because she's very sensible and smart, is read what Anne Bernstein wrote about actually in the Sunday Times and said basically, this, and there's quite an overcrowded field. She said this is the worst piece of legislation on the economy
ever
since the end of apartheid. And I mean, case closed. So I hope that the DA, and I asked the question once again, I don't have the information. I hope they opposed it within the ministry. They have a deputy minister there. I hope they signaled concern in the cabinet when it was put on the cabinet table. And I certainly hope now that the party will sound the trumpet and take all necessary steps to stop this pernicious bill, which is anti-enterprise. And so much so that the mayor of Cape Town, the executive mayor, Jordan Hill-Lewis, was very quick out of the starting blocks to actually denounce the bill about 2 weeks ago in a newspaper article.
Yeah. Two more questions, Tony. And we'll stick with the DA for the moment. Does John Steenhuisen win re-election at the party Congress in, I think it's April next year?
I don't know the answer to that. I understand he is going to stand again for re-election, and the leader always starts with a lot of advantages. Incumbency is not just an ANC advantage in the ANC, it is in the DA too. I know whereof I speak since I was leader for 13 years. But there have obviously been recent controversies, and there's a whole lot of stuff in the public domain, which I think is very ugly, and people are leaking against each other, which suggests that, the Congress might be contested. I don't know. But all I can say is that if he is re-elected, he needs to put out a stall, not on all these personal and political controversies at the moment, as to answer some of the questions that you raised in our interview. Where is the party going? What is its plan for the next 3 years? What is its ideology? Because it's become a bit muffled. And how are we going to get more votes? I mean, the leader's got to do that. And if someone else stands against him, then they need to have a more compelling vision. Look, I will say something, and it's not about the stuff that was in the Daily Maverick. I very much hope the DA, and it's not always comfortable for the leader or the leadership, actually has robust internal debates. I don't know that they do, because, determining a strategy shouldn't be the preserve of 2 or 3 people. It should be fully discussed. It should be completely debated, and it should get buy-in from across the board. And, I just last Monday, I very kindly, courtesy of the Cape Town City Council, despite the ANC's unhappiness, I was awarded a civic honour by the city of Cape Town, which I
congratulations
person at the time. Thank you. And recognition's great. So I went to the year-end caucus function, the DA, to receive it from the mayor. And, a few of and then I agreed to answer questions, and there were a lot of DA councillors, I think 160 or so, a lot. Biggest caucus in the country, they proudly told me. And, 2 or 3 of them were deeply concerned about some of the stuff that's going on, or they read about the party. And I said to them, because it's not my place and I really don't want to get into, the personalities.
No.
I said to them, look, you are stakeholders in this enterprise and you're part of an institution. And any institution that is worth its salt has to actually have an institutional view. I mean, I'm putting this in a very roundabout way. What I'm really saying is, people get upset when they see mud being flung around quite correctly because it shouldn't be flung around in public as it has been recently. But I said the institution itself, being the party, needs to actually take a view and they need to act with the consequences in mind. Now, I think that started to happen on this matter. I think the current name-calling and trawling of stuff in the media stopped. But fundamentally on the questions you raised, which are far more fundamental than the personalities, where's the party going? What's its strategy? What are the tactics to achieve its strategy? What are its bottom lines? That needs to be discussed and agreed by the whole institution, not just by a few personalities.
Yeah. Final question, Tony. Do you think the ANC's lost or is losing or might lose control of the debate about BEE or double B, triple BEE? I see DTIC Minister Parks Towers now promising a thorough review of all BEC laws and rules, but it may be too late. We both read the speeches and articles by one by ANC heavyweight Joel Netshitenzi the other day, and then a brilliant article, I thought, from Investec CEO Fani Titi. I wonder whether the pendulum is swinging. And whether the DA can find a way to insert itself into the debate, or does it simply stand outside and say, no, well, we don't talk about race in the DA. This is for the ANC to sort out.
Well, look, I in fact, not that I did alone, but I was also very struck by the Fani Titi article, and I read about it. And a couple of DA, heavyweight personalities contacted me. They said, yes, he said exactly right. That's what he says. He says, yes, race. Look, Fani Titi's got a certain credibility in this because he makes the acknowledgement that he was lifted up the economic ladder, no small measure, apart from his mathematical skills and overall integrity. He's a beneficiary. So it's easy for a beneficiary. Well, it's not easy because very few businessmen do it. To say, okay, I was in a sense a beneficiary, but we now need to actually have this debate because it's not working as it was intended to work. So that's a very powerful kind of credibility that he brings to the debate, which you could argue the DA, with all the associations, usually wrongly made about the party, has less credibility on that. But on the substance of saying it's not working, and you contrast TT's position, or even the DA position, to John Netshitenzi, who says, oh, well, if we don't have this, we're going to have a revolution. It's complete rubbish, of course. And he doesn't offer any evidence because the immediate refrain, this is the absolute tent pole of the entire ANC policy tarpaulin. It's about all that's left, actually, of any meaning. If it was such a success, why is our economic situation so bad? And, I'm not suggesting we lived in a glorious era, which I thought Johnny Steinberg very usefully demolished today about the
yes, wasn't it? It was a very nice piece.
Very good economic model, which some of us are old enough and ugly enough to remember and to have lived under. But on the other hand, if this thing is such a stellar success, why are we in so much trouble? So that's the obvious question. Now, hopefully, look. Instead of doubling down, they might have a rethink. I'm a bit skeptical. I think the frank issue is there are too many people inside the ANC high command who are the most conspicuous BEE beneficiaries. So for them to make the change will be remarkable. I mean, unless you give them some assurances that they can keep what they've got, which I suppose you can do and say, but not for you, but for the next generation, we're going to rethink.
Tony, thank you so much. We'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope you and your family have a happy and peaceful holiday break. That goes for everyone else listening in. And I'm so grateful to you all. I'll be back one more time this year. But in case you're on the beach by then, be safe and enjoy once again what a really, really good place South Africa is. Bye-bye.